So the next panel we're going to start, it's called Pilots Informing Policy, Case Studies from the Field. My name is Michael Lewis, and I teach at Hunter College in New York, and I will be the moderator for this panel. And before we get going, I want to say welcome, first of all. This, like all the other panels today that are live, will also appear on Crowdcast later on. We also have sponsors that I want to mention, if I can find it here in my list. They are the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, Aid Kit, and Steady. So we have two moderators, one moderator, two speakers today. Since their bios are in the program, I thought I would just say their names and their affiliation. So one is Leah Hamilton, and she is an associate professor of social work at Appalachian State University. She's also a senior fellow at the Jane Family Institute. And she is going to be appearing on the screen at some point, I believe. And the other speaker is Sid Frankel, who's here with us live. He is an associate professor of social work at the University of Manitoba. And they're going to go, the order, the arrangement or the sequence will be first Leah talking for about 5 to 10 minutes about some work she's doing. Sid will then follow up. I have 2 questions we prepared for them, and then we'll open it up to the audience. That's the plan, right? So Leah Hamilton's going to go first. And again, this is really looking at policy implementation or going from pilots to policy and case studies, right, from their work. So Leah is going to go first. Hello, Leah. How are you? Can you hear us? Good. All right.
Yes.
You're up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Should I get started? Okay. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. I can hear an echo of myself. I don't know if it's possible to mute that on your end, but if not, no worries. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. I am the principal investigator for the Hudson, New York Basic Income Pilot, and also for one that's launching right now in 3 sites across Georgia. This presentation is about the first year of a 5-year pilot in Hudson, New York, and these are some really brief qualitative and quantitative findings from the first year. So really quickly, I'll give you a little background on the pilot. First launched in fall of 2020 with 25 participants. 15 agreed to participate in the research. I did wave 1 interviews and surveys in early 2021, and then again in July of 2022, face-to-face. And please stop me if you have any questions, but I know we only have a few minutes. The Hudson, New York pilot is really fantastic in how diverse it is. We have a wide range of race, gender, educational, income representation. So we've really got a broad spectrum of folks in this pilot. So some of the themes that arose in my research is how HudsonUP is, and let me back up in case anyone's not familiar with the particulars of HudsonUP. It is $500 per month for 5 years. So it's one of the longest running current pilots that I'm aware of. So when I asked people at year 1 how it had affected their lives, some of the common qualitative themes were that it provided greater financial stability and security. Some people are using it for, essential bills and other household essentials. People say things like, I just take the money from HudsonUP, pay my bills, and it comes to just about $500. So I leave that alone in my bank account. Hudson Up has really affected me in a positive way. I feel I can just forget it, and it takes care of my bills. It keeps me straight. It's helping me provide for my son, pay my rent. It revolutionized my financial situation. I don't have to worry as much about how I can pay my rent. Some people describe it like a safety net in uncertain times more than anything, just knowing that I have a little cushion, a little safety net. I feel during the pandemic, I felt safe and healthy. I've been scared for everyone in my family, but not for myself, which is a wild feeling. Um, so apart from sort of like basic financial security, basic needs met, people have started thinking about future planning over the course of the pilot and what they're going to do after the pilot. So a lot of people are talking about saving the money. They're using it to pay down debt, saving up for a house. Another person said, I'm trying not to touch it because I really want to use it to set myself up for the future. Several people are talking about using it for higher ed and small business development, getting their associate's degree, being able to go back to school, Hudson, New York is a pretty touristy area for people, escaping New York City for the weekend. So one person's thinking about using it to turn their house into an Airbnb. One person started a small business using a campground. So a lot of sort of small business percolating and going back to school. I also asked people about their employment situations in the quantitative survey. Several people at year one had either started new jobs or were able to return to work, or their small businesses had seen renewed demand. And I want to be clear that this isn't all, of course, just about Hudson Up. In July of 2021, the pandemic was, things were looking up, businesses were starting to reopen. One person said that last year was awful, 2020 was awful. We all know that, and that things have started picking up by 2021. So here we'll see that the number of people working full-time and part-time went from 29% to 63%. So again, we can't credit that completely with the basic income, but I think it's safe to say that people didn't suddenly quit their jobs because they got this payment. I think really more incredibly is the outcomes it's had on people's health. So this is the short form 36. A lot of the NGI pilots are using this, and the really short summary of this is looking at a range of different physical and emotional well-being factors. Folks improved from baseline to the end of year one in every single area. They stayed the same in energy and fatigue. This is the Kessler-10. This is a psychological distress scale, and that went down on average. People talked about the improvements it made to their health. So Hudson Up was decreased stress and improved physical health for a lot of participants. And I don't think this should be really surprising to any of us in the basic income community, but just the fact that people are really experiencing it in real time. They're saying, I'm not stressed out anymore, which improves my health. People are talking about improvements in their sleep, they're eating better, drinking less, exercising more. My health has been good. I've been doing more exercise. My sleep hygiene has been amazing. So people are sleeping better because they have less stress. Their mental health is improving. Again, not huge surprises to any of us, but I think really important to inform the public policy conversation. Another interesting thing is that a lot of people talked about how it improved their relationships with the people around them. So for example, with their family, people say, I can contribute to my parents when they need it. I help my adult children because life can happen. Before now, I would have been embarrassed to be asking for assistance constantly from my family, but now I'm in the position to help them. Another woman said, I was able to go caretake for my mom for a month in another state, just because she had the Hudson Up money. There are also people talk about improved relationships with their friends. They can, buy their friends little treats, that sort of thing. I would say that I've been able to help my friends more when they need it. I'm trying not to be so precious. I might as well cultivate this relationship. And then people also talk about improved relationships with their community. They've been volunteering more, and really enjoy getting to do that with their time. And then another thing people talk to me a lot about is an improved sense of agency. So people talk about having more confidence to set boundaries around their well-being and their work-life balance. People talk about trying not to overwork themselves, moving out of crowded housing situations, waiting for a job that they really want rather than going back to fast food or retail, leaving a job so that was too far away to work closer to home. One person said, I'm still going back to bartending, but not at a dive bar, to bartend at a restaurant, to stay for earlier hours, style bartending. So this is an argument we make a lot in the basic income community, is it gives people agency to, find the employment situations that are right for them rather than having to take just, anything out of necessity. A lot of the single mothers talked about the agency it gave them to provide for their children. They have stability, something to look forward to take care of my children. HudsonUP has affected me in a beneficial way. I was able to get a better vehicle to transport my kids back and forth to appointments. I think this is really important. I think the one mother said, I think it has affected my family because my kids don't see me stressing as much as trying to continue to keep food in the house, snacks in the cabinet. I'm not stressed out about bills. It's like that money is just a flow of money, and sometimes we get to go out and do fun activities because it's extra money left over. So real quick, I'll just summarize all of that. So we did see more than doubling of employment in the first year. We saw improved physical and mental health across the board, decreased psychological distress. Some of the qualitative themes were greater stability and security, improved ability to make plans for the future, improved physical and mental health, improved relationships, and increased feelings of individual agency. And just as a FYI, this pilot did expand to an additional 50 participants in fall of 2021. And I've done baseline interviews with all of those folks. And then a third cohort of 53 individuals will be adding this fall of 2022. And I'll stop there and hope I didn't run over my time too much.
You're good. All right. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Leah. Very interesting to hear that. I'm going to try and briefly do 4 things with you. One, I'm going to put experiments into the context of the various approaches to introducing or implementing a basic income. 2, I'm going to tell you about the 2 Canadian experiments. 3, I'm going to tell you about 2 sad lessons that we learned from the Canadian experiments. And 4, I'm going to suggest how we might take action to yield better outcomes. Next slide, please. So there are probably 4 ways that a basic income can be implemented. First, we can do what we do with most social programs. We just introduce them, full implementation. And the risks there depend on how well the implementation plan was developed. So you will remember that when Obamacare was first implemented, there were failures with the site and people being able to register, and that gives opponents a target. Secondly, we can have pilot studies. I'll distinguish this from experiments. Pilot studies are ways of developing and working out the bugs in the systems, in the registration systems and in the benefit delivery systems. And the problem with them is they take some time and they do allow the detractors to coalesce and provide them a target. Thirdly, in Canada and to some extent in the US, there are programs that have some elements of basic incomes, and an approach has been suggested to avoid the frontal opposition based on cost and supposed work disincentives by not introducing a basic income in a high-profile way, but in working on slow incremental changes to existing programs to eventually fashion them into basic income programs. 2 problems here. One is that it takes a long time, and again, there's lots of time for opponents to organize. 2, the characteristics of the old program and the newly introduced basic income elements are confounded, and it may be unclear what is causing the problems and what is causing the benefits. And fourthly, we have experiments randomized experiments, and quasi-experiments like the saturation sites. Saturation sites where everyone is offered the possibility of a basic income. And the main problem we have found with experiments, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is that even when they're successful, they do not seem to lead to implementation. They don't require policymakers to make a commitment to anything except having an experiment. Next slide, please. So the two Canadian experiments that have occurred, the Manitoba Basic Annual Income Experiment, MINCOME, went on from 1974 to 79. It had two components, a randomized experiment that had 8 different basic income conditions and one control condition. And it was designed to test the supposed work disincentive effects. The saturation site, which Evelyn Forget has studied. Evelyn did two things. She analyzed some effects, like education effects, by comparing with administrative data from other sites. And she also developed a quasi-experiment. It wasn't a randomized experiment. There was not a randomly assigned control group, but she used one of the strongest quasi-experimental designs to develop a comparison group. And here we have, approaching the first lesson, this MINCOME was canceled before it finished. There are two main factors in the cancellation. One is that the federal and provincial government, who were partners, both changed. Conservative governments were elected in both cases when there had been a Liberal and a new Democratic, a Social Democrat government. And secondly, Canada moved into recession, and these conservative governments did not want to spend money on the experiment. Next slide, please. So just to look at this briefly, the findings of MINCOME are impressive. The labor supply findings saw at best moderate decreases in labor supply, 1% for men, 3% for married women, 5% for unmarried women, and as you heard in the panel this morning, some of these so-called limitations or decreases in labor supply are for very good reasons, like being off work longer to seek better jobs, or women staying home to care for their newborns. The health and education findings from the Dauphin saturation site, an 8.5% decrease in hospitalization rates, and much improved high school retention. Next slide, please. The second experiment in Canada, the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. So there were 3 randomized experimental sites studying a broad range of outcomes. It lasted only from 2017 to 2018, and it was a provincial pilot or a provincial experiment, and it ended when a conservative government was elected to replace the Liberal government that had put this into place. Several studies, including one that Leah and my colleague Jim Mulvale did, found improved health, well-being, food security, social connection, education, and employment among recipients, even though most of them received a basic income for a very short time, most of them less than a year. Next slide, please. So what are the lessons? Lesson 1, political risk. Both experiments were canceled before completion when political parties, priorities, and sometimes the economic circumstances changed. Secondly, advocacy failure. You've just seen positive results, and they did not lead to adoption. Next slide, please. How can we minimize the cancellation risk? So as far as possible, we might work on removing experiments from a narrow partisan kind of framing by, for example, talking to all political parties and incorporating some features in the experiment and some research questions of interest to each party. For example, conservative parties might be interested in whether a basic income increases entrepreneurship and so on. Secondly, the basic incomes have to come earlier in a government's mandate. So the environment for a basic income experiment should be softened even before a government's in place during the election, and there should be pressure on governments to implement the experiment, again, early in their mandate. And finally, the advocacy for public and civil society support should not end when a government agrees to implement an experiment. It should continue to make sure that the experiment continues. Next slide, please. Okay, the adoption failure. Well, here we might have a very naive model about how political and senior bureaucratic policymakers make decisions. So most of the experiments in social policy, including in basic income, have a kind of enlightenment model. We will give them the data, we will give them the findings, and the light will go on in their brains and they will do the right thing. But we know that that's not the case. And Carol Weiss, many years ago, the late Carol Weiss, did some research that identified the kinds of tests that political and bureaucratic decision makers use to make decisions, and her findings have been validated and expanded through time. So she said there were two kinds of tests. First of all, truth tests. And the decisions are made on the basis of the research quality and also consistency with the decision maker's beliefs, knowledge, and values. This means two things. This means we have to frame the strengths of the research, not just the limitations. All research has limitations, including randomized clinical trials in the health field, but there needs to be a framing of the strengths and a marshaling of evidence from experts. And secondly, we need to talk to the key decision makers to understand what their existing beliefs are and what they take as credible, so we can frame the findings as much as possible in ways that validate those. Next slide, please. The second test that we found that policymakers use are called utility tests. Are the findings useful? And here, one of the criteria here is, does the research demonstrate not just that a basic income is effective or not just what its outcomes are, but how feasible changes can actually be made? So the research and the documentation of the research has to move to the point of how can it actually be implemented. And the emphasis is on feasible in two ways. Technically feasible, and we heard a lot about that from a tech panel earlier, but also politically feasible, because no government will do something that they think will get them in serious political trouble. Now, challenges to the status quo are possible. So we know that large institutions, including governments, demonstrate a kind of path dependency. All else being equal, they will keep doing what they've always done. That's probably why we still have income support programs like welfare. Now, political decision makers are ready to accept a challenge to that status quo, but it has to be framed in a credible way that not only in this case presents the benefits of a basic income, but also compares it to what exists and demonstrates that a basic income is better. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
I'm assuming Leah is somewhere in here somewhere. So I had two questions, but I might just go with one and then open it up earlier to the audience, depending on the response. But Sid got into this a little bit toward the end of his comments, but you may want to say more. But the question is really this. Pilots have to be designed in certain ways and implemented in certain ways. So the question really is, in your view, given what you know and what you've done so far, what do you think are the best ways to design and implement a pilot in a way that is more likely to lead to policy change and to help advocates? Like how can you design and implement these things in a way that really helps the cause for change, both advocates and policy change?
I really said some of this.
I want to start with that. I want to start with Leah for that reason.
I didn't know you were back.
Yeah, Leah. Yeah.
Hi, thanks.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. I think I agree with Sid that we can't just assume that the evidence will lead to policy change. That's so we really do need to be keeping an eye on the political discourse, and still, unfortunately, the political discourse is about employment, those sorts of things. So we have to keep those things in mind, even if if we all fundamentally know that, people don't quit their jobs because they got basic income. So we need to keep an eye on what's going on in the political discourse and make sure those things are weaved into our research design. I also think that there is right now in the basic income community, we need to go from knowing that cash works to knowing best practices. So for example, in the Georgia pilot that's launching right now, we're experimenting with two different treatment arms. One is a basic income, same amount for every month, and one is a lump sum up front, and then slightly lower amounts. So we need to start experimenting with best practices so that when the next policy window opens, not only can we say cash works, we can say here's equity practices for how cash works. And I'll turn it over to Sid there. I'm sure he has lots of thoughts.
Of course, I agree with Leah, but I'd say the discourse is important and the narratives that governments are putting out is important. But it's also important to talk to them, to understand what they believe, what they read, what they're hoping to do, and to talk not only to the politicians, but to senior bureaucrats who will advise politicians. For example, there are questions about construct validity here that are important, and we need to know what the political decision makers think. So the prime question often raised about trials and experiments is, these are short-term, everyone knows they're short-term. Are the participants responding more to the short-term nature, and would they respond quite differently to a full-blown policy permanently implemented? That's something, it would be interesting to know what politicians and the senior civil servants who advise them think about that. And if that's the case, that will lead to some different emphases. For example, it may lead to longer pilots. It may, so that those kinds of effects attenuate. It may lead to kind of changing the experimental procedures so that they're less invasive and the participants are responding less to them. So to the extent it's possible, we should try, to make this kind of research collaborative with the decision makers. So we're in the position of speaking truth to power. We're likely to do better if we speak some of their truth to power, is what I'm trying to get across. The second thing I would say is we can't separate, and I think when Leah used the term best practices, she was talking about this. We can't separate the demonstration of the effect from what that demonstration will mean for what an eventual fully implemented policy should look like. We have to integrate into the studies ways of collecting data on what we think the best practices are, so that ideally we can demonstrate to political decision makers, yes, we know this works. We know that these eligibility procedures work. We know that, for example, people are going to report accurately on their income if they're asked in this kind of way. So I would say the pilots become more complex because they have to deal with a broader range of issues.
I think this session is supposed to end at 3:45. That gives us about 9 or 10 minutes left. So I'm going to stop with my questions and go to the audience, if that's okay.
And I have a couple virtual ones to start us off with. If anyone else would like to come up and ask a question, please do. From Elaine here, specifically for Sid, she's asking if workers had a basic income that covered basic needs, which is what Canadians are advocating for, they could walk away from poorly paid, precarious jobs without benefits or sick days. Is basic income too threatening to corporate business interests, especially those in the service sector and food industry?
It may be threatening to them, but well, the question becomes, is that a good thing? Do we want pressure on those kinds of employers to make those jobs less precarious and so on? And we should remember that this is an issue that has been repeatedly brought before Canadian politicians. So politicians may have an interest in doing something about precarity of that kind in the labor market. In Canada, there are programs meant for low-income workers. One way to approach the political decision makers is to kind of get that problem on the table, not the threat to employers, but get the problem on the table that what government is now doing for low-income workers, for example, there's something in Canada called the Canada Workers Benefit, it's just not working very well. And the public realizes this, government. We're ready to propose here an alternative, and we want to know what criteria it would have to meet for you to accept it. And we would have to take seriously the political problem of government dealing with pressure from these employers that provide precarious jobs, and try and determine whether our research might have some role in helping government to respond to that.
Hi, Ari from New York. I have a question actually about the participants themselves and whether or not they had ever heard of a universal basic income or guaranteed income or anything of that sort when they first learned about the pilots, and what conversations were like after that. Did they become UBI believers? Or did they participate and then that was that? Like, I'm just wondering, you know, kind of as we think about pilots to policy, whether what they think.
Sorry. I really love that question because I think you're right on target. Most people have not heard of UBI, but as the pilot goes on, people tell me. I mean, I have one person in particular I call my UBI cheerleader now. She just has lots to say and she can't wait to spread the word. But a lot of people tell me I'm participating in this research because I want to see more people get this. I make sure that I emphasize that I'm using your perspectives to inform the national conversation around guaranteed income, basic income, and they tell me that's why I want to participate, because I think more people need this, more single parents need this under them. So I think the answer is yes. Of course, not 100% of everybody, but I see that happening, absolutely.
There's a great question here from Timothy from our virtual audience. Are there UBI experiments that show the effects of a UBI on the middle class? Could such experiments and evidence help address implementation issues if people learn the benefits to the middle class?
Well, I can say the two experiments I talked about, the middle class would not have been eligible based on income tests for those benefits.
Leah, in your work at all? What do you think?
I can't think of any strict basic income pilots. All of them that I can think of were income tested. However, I think we could expand a little bit our thinking to Social Security, the child tax credit, and we see similar results with those things. I think the child tax credit is probably the best example we can think of, that it's was nearly universal and certainly covered the middle class, and we continue to see positive results there for those families because we know that the middle class is being stretched right now.
And we've got a similar situation in Canada with the Canada Child Benefit, which is essentially a partial basic income for families with children. And I think it goes to almost, or I know it goes to almost 95% of Canadian families with children. And there is evidence about positive effects, for example, on a range of child development indicators and a range of school preparedness indicators.
We have 2 minutes. I think anyone? No? Yeah.
Hello, my name's Emma. I'm from Canada. I was just wondering what happened to those participants when the project came to an end, both in Ontario and in Manitoba.
This has been documented by documentary filmmakers, and some of this by Evelyn Forget herself. So there were serious effects for the lives of many people. So in Ontario, and I think Leah can speak to this, there were people who had to give up plans to go to school. There were people who had started small businesses or self-employment projects that had to finish. In Dauphin, Evelyn Forget has presented evidence of two things: that the education effects disappeared a few years after the basic income ended, and the health effects disappeared a few years after that.
Yeah, I think Sid's probably the bigger expert on this one, but when I talked to the Ontario pilot folks, that's exactly what they said, that they had been making all these plans that they now had to roll back, because the people I spoke to specifically were folks who had disabilities and were traditionally on the Canadian disability program, and they have severe income and asset testing. So all the plans that they had to sort of get themselves on their feet over the course of the pilot, so that they were not subject to sort of the income and asset restrictions of traditional disability assistance. They were having to walk back all those plans, and they were going to be again subject to those restrictions, and they were pretty upset about it.
I think we've come to the end. It's 3:45. So I want to give the two speakers a round of applause, or that, whatever you do. Thank you. Thank you. Nice seeing you, Leah.
Nice to meet you, at least virtually.
You too. Lovely to see you.